I work for Bumblebee Conservation Trust, and I have worked in conservation in Pembrokeshire for about 15 years in various capacities, but my specialism is plants, wildflowers and insects, particularly bumblebees. And I'm just going to give you a very brief introduction to bumblebees in Pembrokeshire and a couple of things to look out for. And perhaps you can share this information with others during the coming summer. So I'm currently working on a project for Skills for Bees Cymru, and I am going to be doing quite a bit of work in Pems over the coming months, so do look out for that as well. Okay. So bees, there are lots of bees, lots of different types of bees in Britain, and Pembrokeshire is particularly rich in species. The total number of bees in the UK is around about 275. So we actually have quite a lot of different bee species. They all look different and they have different life cycles and habits, and they forage on different flowers. And Pembrokeshire, because of our lovely coastal habitats in particular, and flower-rich coastal grasslands, we actually have quite a high number of those species which occur in the UK. In the UK, the honeybee is probably the best known bee in many ways, and there's only one species of honeybee in the UK, and they all the worker females look like this. The queens are a bit bigger, but look pretty similar. So all honeybees in the UK are of one species, and they're considered really domesticated insects. Okay, so that's what honeybees look like. Bumblebees are different to honeybees, primarily in the way they look, but also the way in which they live their life. And we'll be focusing on these in the majority of the talk. And in Britain, there are 24 different species of bumblebee. Okay, in Pembrokeshire, we have 19 of those 24 species. And solitary bees, well, they're the most diverse and biggest group of bees in Britain, but strangely, they're the one that's almost always overlooked. And we have about 250 species of these incredible bees in Britain. Okay, it would take a lot of talks to even begin to describe solitary bees. So we're not going to go into any detail on those here. There are also lots of insects that occur and in the UK and in Pembrokeshire also that are brilliant bumblebee and solitary and honeybee mimics. And here's two of them, which are quite common in this county. They're actually both flies, but they have evolved to mimic bumblebees, but are in fact harmless. So people often get quite disturbed when they see these guys coming into their conservatories, but they're actually stingless flies. Okay, so we're going to go into a little bit more detail about bumblebees in particular now. If you remember, there are 24 species in the UK. We have 19 of them in Pembrokeshire, and bumblebees are really the most sort of noticeable. They're the biggest, they're the fluffiest, and the noisiest of our British bees. So unlike honeybees, bumblebees don't make honey, okay? And because of this, they mostly can't survive our British winter. Down in the south of England, some bumblebees do stay active through the winter, and honeybees are able to survive. The colony survives through the winter by eating the honey that they've made. But bumblebees need to hibernate. So when we're looking for bumblebees along the coast and the lovely areas inland in Pembrokeshire, we can kind of look out for them based on what they're doing at different times of the year. And the picture on the right there is of a bumblebee queen who's been found hibernating in a flower pot. And now in sort of February, March and April, they are beginning to emerge, so that the big buzzing queens you see are waking up from solitary hibernation. Okay, so the bumblebee year starts around now with the queens emerging, and they often feed on things like willow, which flowers really, really early and carries lots of pollen, because bees are completely vegetarian and they feed their young on pollen. So that's a really good plant to have in your garden, by the way, for emerging queens. And then the queen begins to build her nest. Okay, and this illustration shows the queen laying her eggs on a ball of nectar and pollen, and the little sort of flask there in front of her is a little cup that she makes out of wax secreted from her body, and she fills it with nectar for her to drink while she sits on her eggs and broods them. It's quite amazing, actually. Okay. And she will go out collecting nectar and pollen until her first batch of female workers hatch. And in the sort of late spring and into the summer, you see more and more bumblebees, and these are all female workers gathering nectar and pollen to take back to the nest to feed more and more larvae, which are produced by the queen. So through the summer, you might have bumblebee nests in your garden, and you might have between 50 and 200 workers for each nest, each of them produced by one queen. And that is the time when they're really, really busy collecting pollen and nectar, pollinating our vegetables and our wildflowers, and that is when we'll see them prevalently in our gardens. All really, really busy. Lovely sound as well through the summer. And then at the end of the summer, the queen lays eggs which turn into male bumblebees, and they will go off. They don't do any foraging for pollen. They don't defend the nest or clean the nest or look after the nest. They simply fly off as soon as they're pupated into a male bumblebee, and they go off to look. And that bottom picture there shows the mating of the small males with new large queens that are also produced at the end of the summer. And once the queen is mated, the new daughter queen, she will look for a place to hibernate, and the rest of the colony will die. So it's only the queens that survive through the winter in their hibernating spots under the ground or in compost heaps or at the bases of hedgerows, etc., which is why sort of leaving wild areas in the garden is really, really good for hibernating bumblebees. And we get lots of questions about nests, but as you can see, the nests, unlike honeybee nests, bumblebee nests don't last from year to year. So if you get bumblebees nest in 1 year, there's no guarantee they'll come back the following year. And the nests can be observed as well from a safe distance because they're not aggressive, obviously, unless you really threaten them. Okay, so when you are out and about in Pembrokeshire, really from now onwards, you will see large bumblebee queens looking really lovely and sort of fresh as they've been asleep all winter. They haven't been out and about, getting sort of battered and bruised. So they often look lovely when they emerge in the spring, and they will be feeding and looking for nest sites. This is quite a nice time to look for bumblebees, actually. And then, as the illustration showed before, as the summer goes on, the workers begin to emerge from the nest, and you'll get higher and higher numbers, and they are smaller than the queens of their species. You can sometimes see really tiny bumblebees, actually. They'll vary depending on how much food they've had when they were at the larval stage. Oh. Hang on. There you go. Oops. Computer. Right, and then after the workers at the end of the summer, the males will emerge from the nests, and these can often be different colours from the females of the same species. So this is a red-tailed male, and the females of this species actually are all black with a red tail, but the males have yellow moustaches and yellow collars behind their head. The scientific name for this is sexual dimorphism, where the males and females look quite different. But the males are also different in that none of them have a sting. They're completely harmless. So you can actually handle the males, but I don't recommend doing that unless you've had lots of experience. But yeah, so that's the sort of life cycle of the bumblebee, what you might see through the season. And as I'm sure you know, bumblebees are absolutely critical for pollination, which is the way that flowering plants reproduce. And many of our crop and food species are actually pollinated by bumblebees. They're really super efficient pollinators, and you can see this one. She's nectaring on that flower, so she's drinking the nectar, but she's absolutely covered in pollen grains. So when she goes to the next flower, those will be transferred from flower to flower, allowing the flowers to reproduce. She does actually collect pollen as well, to take back to the nest to feed the young, and the adults drink nectar for energy. So you want in your garden flowers that produce both pollen and nectar, that bumblebees can actually access is really important. And some of our key foodstuffs are pollinated only by bumblebees actually, because they have the longest tongues of any of our bees. And so they are really critically important. Tomatoes, for example, can only be pollinated by bumblebees. And in Australia, where they don't have any bumblebees, they have to pollinate their tomatoes by hand. So yeah, they have an economic as well as a natural value. I'm sure lots of you have heard that in recent decades, our bee species have been in decline. With honeybees, this tends to be a lot around disease. I'm sure you've heard of some of the things that have hit honeybee colonies, and beekeepers have had massive problems. But for wild bees like bumblebees, it is primarily habitat loss that has had the most damaging effect since the Second World War. And this is due mostly to changes in farming practices since the end of the Second World War. So we've lost our hay meadows, and we've lost our clover leaves, and our small scale farms, and a lot of hedgerows where bumblebees like to nest and also to hibernate. So they've lost habitat and food basically. And as we've gone over to silage and sort of large scale arable crops, unfortunately food for bumblebees has declined, and this has had a catastrophic effect on distribution and abundance. And in fact, two bumblebee species went extinct in the late 20th century in the UK, and we have two more on the verge of extinction now out of our 24, one of which occurs in Pembrokeshire, which I will come to at the end. So, out of our 24 species, we have 8 that remain, despite all the difficulties they faced. We have 8 that remain fairly common. And these are our 8 common bumblebee species. As part of my project, I am going to be running identification courses to help people to learn to identify these species and record them, because we urgently need more data on both our common and our rarer species. But these are, the top left one is the Bathtail Bumblebee, which hasn't got the name on, unfortunately, but that one on the left is probably the most common you'll see in the spring. That's the buff-tailed. The second one is the white-tailed. The third one, the red-tailed bumblebee. Okay, so that's the female. And if you remember earlier, I showed you the male with the yellow moustache and the yellow collar. The female is really beautiful. They're really quite common in Pembrokeshire. The fourth one on the top there is the early bumblebee. And as its name suggests, it's one of the first to emerge in the spring. And it's a slightly smaller species than the others. Okay, bottom left is the garden bumblebee. That species has the longest tongue of any bee in Britain, and you can see her tongue there and her long face, which accommodates the tongue when it's rolled up. And that species will access the deepest of flowers, things like monkshood and foxgloves, because she has such a long face and tongue. This is the Heath Bumblebee, second on the left at the bottom, and they really like feeding on heathlands, things like heathers. And then the common carded bumblebee, which is our commonest ginger bumblebee. And bottom right there is the tree bumblebee, and this only came into Britain in about 2001. I think it was 20 years ago. Came over naturally from France. So could be indicative of the climate warming, because it's come from the south. And this is the bumblebee that loves to nest in people's bird boxes. Okay, so we call those the big 8 because they're common and widespread out of our 24. Right, okay, just a little bit of detail to finish off now for you to maybe have a look out for this summer. Like I said, Pembrokeshire has particularly flower-rich coastal habitat. It doesn't have much flower-rich coastal habitat away from the coast because it is primarily agricultural land, and there aren't enough flowers to sustain high numbers of pollinators, although there are lots of people now interested in creating meadows, lots of people owning small patches of land and managing those for biodiversity, and that will massively help inland population of bees and bumblebees in particular. But we do have on the coast some of the most amazing grassland in Wales, particularly down on the Castlemartin Peninsula. And I've done quite a lot of bumblebee work here with the National Park and various volunteers. And that photograph there is of volunteers on a rare bee survey 2 years ago, looking for rare bumblebees, rare species down at St Govan's Head. So, you know, there are some really good things happening, and there's lots of staff in the National Park that are very keen on bumblebees, which is great. So, a couple of species for you to look out for during the summer, which I know to occur in Pembrokeshire, and they're species we need more data of. And this is the first one. This is the Bilberry Bumblebee, Latin name Bumbus Silvarum. It is, I think, Britain's most beautiful bumblebee. It is completely stunning. It's almost like a little parrot with its bright orangey red abdomen, the lower half of the bee, if you like. And it has 2 bright yellow stripes on the middle part between the wings, so that's the thorax. There are other bees with red tails, but this one is, the whole abdomen is very bright. And the thing is with the Bilberry Bumblebee, as the name suggests, you can really narrow down where you look for it. So if you live or walk in the Preseli Hills, in the uplands of Pembrokeshire, I discovered this bee there for the first time about 3 or 4 years ago, and the first time it had been recorded in Pembrokeshire. And this bee is thought to be in decline through loss of habitat throughout the UK, and it is very much a species of upland areas where bilberry occurs. The queens love to feed on bilberry. It's good to take your camera or your phone so that you can try and get a photograph of this bee. But we'd love more records of it. So that's one to look out for. And the best time is during May and June when the bilberry is in flower. Even though the bees do go on through the summer and they feed on other things, you can often find them during bilberry flowering time. So that's kind of quite a nice thing to do. And the second species I'm going to show you is much more difficult to recognise and much more difficult to spot, but I really want to tell you about this because it is a really special bumblebee. And it's the shrill cardabee, or Bumbus Silvarum. Now, this species used to be widespread in the south of Britain, and it has gradually declined in distribution and number. So now it only exists in 5 isolated places in the whole of the UK. And 3 of those are in Wales. So there's one population on the Gwent levels, there's one around Bridgend, and there's one on the Castlemartin Peninsula. And so they are absolutely critical to the survival of this species in the UK. And it's currently the subject of a conservation strategy, which will be kicking off this year in Pembrokeshire and the other areas. But the shrill cardabee is not quite as noticeable as the Bilberry Bumblebee. It's much more grey in appearance, but it has this wide black band between its wings, which you can see there in the 2 photographs. Okay, so in between the cream colour, it's got a black band. And it's got an orange tip right on the very tip of its tail, so not at all like the Bilberry Bumblebee. If you can see on that one, just a hint of orange hairs there on those 2 segments of the bee at the end there. So, but it does always have that, but it takes a little bit of kind of keen-eyed concentration to see it. Now, this is a species of flower-rich grassland, which is why it's declined so much, because its habitat is pretty much gone. And that still occurs down around Stack Rocks and St Govan's Head. The best time to see it is late in the summer. It's a late flying species, and I have seen it down there in August and September if you just walk the coast path. Again, camera is a really, really good thing to have. And if you're keen, have your GPS on as well when you take your photographs, so you have a photograph and you know exactly where the bee occurred, because that's really important for us to know where they are. So the shrill cardabee is a really, really special species for us to be proud of, really, in Pembrokeshire, and for us to work to the other thing is, as its name suggests, it has a really shrill, high-pitched buzz. It is much higher than most other bumblebees, and you do get your earring when you get used to it. But easier to perhaps spot in the first instance. Okay, and just if anybody's interested, a couple of identification guides to help you, because this has just been a very, very brief introduction. Like I said, I am going to be doing identification training, so you can look out for that in Pembrokeshire to encourage more people to get into bumblebee recording. But this guide is a really lovely introduction to bumblebees, which is produced by Bumblebee Conservation Trust. I think it's £10 off their website, and it's really, really simple to use, and it's kind of nice to have on a coffee table. Lots and lots of big, lovely photographs and clear guidance. And then this book is a bit more heavy going, and that has all of the wild bee species in Britain listed, and it's more of a scientific key, really, but it is a fantastic book. Okay, so that covers all the solitary bees as well, by Stephen Falk, and that's available on Amazon and online in lots of places. Okay, thank you very, very much. I hope you found that interesting. Just to point out as well, that picture is also from Castle Martin, and that is actually a brown-banded cardabee, which is another rare species we have on the Pembrokeshire coast. Quite hard to identify, but very, very lovely to see down there. Do have a look on Bumblebee Conservation Trust website, and there's the web address there. Loads of ID resources and information to expand massively on what I've said today. And also that's my email address there. If you do have any sightings, you can send me a photograph and you know where you saw it, particularly of the Bilberry Bumblebee or the Shrill Cardbee. That would be amazing. And I can actually get some resources to Alex as well, to have for when events are on again, with identification features on little cards and things like that. So yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Claire. What do their nests? They're just a hole in the ground, aren't they? What do you look out for if you're wanting to?
Looking for nests is almost an impossible quest. Okay. It's notoriously difficult to find them. It depends on the species. So, for example, the Bathtail, which is a really, really common one, they tend to nest in old mouse holes and other rodent holes. So they could be under the ground, but it won't be a hole that the bee is excavated. The cardabees, like the one that was on the last slide, the brown-banded carder, they like to nest in tusky grass.
Yeah, because I've seen them come out of the grass before and wondering, I'm not, Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, and then the tree bumblebee loves nested in nest boxes because it mimics its own habitat. So, so yeah, it depends on the species pretty much, you know, as to exactly what the nest is like.
Okay, thank you. And I just also wondered, you're saying how they've got really long tongues, whether are they able to feed on shorter sort of length flowers, or does that make it so that they can only feed on certain flowers? Is that what is sort of impacting them as well, or?
Yeah, so basically, bumblebees, their tongues vary a lot depending on species, and in a way, so within bumblebees, like, hang on a minute, Alex. Yeah, we can say that bumblebees have longer tongues than honeybees and most solitary bees, but within the 24 species of bumblebee, there is a huge variation. So yes, it does naturally sort of divide their resources, if you like. So bumblebees, they can still forage on shallower flowers if they've got a long tongue, but they're less likely to, because by having a long tongue, they can go to flowers with less competition.
Yeah, I see.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So the open, shallow flowers are attractive to solitary bees and honeybees, generally speaking. And then, for example, common cardabees have a relatively long tongue, so they really like things like clover, which is quite deep, but they might not go for the really deep flowers, whereas the garden bumblebee will, because it can utilise without any competition. It's quite a complex thing.
Yeah.